All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to attempt this webcam again today and see how long it'll let me go. And but we'll try not to tarry too long so that I don't lose this connection, and also that I don't lose your attention as well. Uh, but I thought that since we're so close to the exam time for the third exam, instead of just hitting on some general theme, which I usually enjoy doing, I thought I would uh, just hop through follow through some of the concepts that's going to be on the test from your text, and so I'm just going to follow through some of these concepts, just a quick definition, and if I have a few examples maybe that aren't in the text to help clarify as much as possible for the next exam. And then hopefully after that, for the last few chapters, I'll be able to do some more thematic type of short lecturette. But I just want to walk you through, since we have two chapters, I'll try to be as brief as possible while also giving just a few more insights. First of all, on our chapter on race and ethnicity, chapter 9, the chapter starts out by making a distinction between race and ethnicity. And it's still important that, even though I've exposed you to the idea that race is a biological myth, we still use it at this point anyway for analytical reasons, so that we can judge, for example, comparing ethnic groups that have been racialized over time, such as African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, to non-racialized minority groups such as your white immigrant groups. Then we can use these two, the race and ethnicity, analytically to judge different historical experiences through time. It gives us a better judgment of where groups are today. For example, our ethnic groups that have been racialized, we know that there were also involuntary minority groups, and experienced a much harsher treatment, discrimination and prejudice that led to decades and decades of being excluded from society or marginalized. Whereas the white ethnic groups, even though they did also experience harsh times in immigrating to the United States in terms of prejudice and discrimination, were voluntary minority groups, and at least they were able to come here with some resources, right? With families intact, resources that weren't they weren't locked in chains or forced by the end of a gun or experienced genocide, cultural side. So race analytically is a group that has its identity is around physical differences, perceived physical differences such as skin color. And I use the term that I don't think the text talks that much about the term, but one very popular term used in my area of study is called racialization. And in fact, all various different cultural groups in the United States are what we call ethnic groups. That is, the differences between us is based in differences in terms of cultural production, dialect, various norms and values and beliefs. Those variations are based in cultural distinctions, cultural differences. Same with those groups that have been racialized as well. It's just that we've had there's more, but there's three major ethnic groups in the United States that were historically racialized. And racialized denotes a historical process of designating an ethnic group along genetic lines. And of course that was done, if you read the chapter, for various reasons that were negative for the most part. And I think you can read and find out much about that in the text itself. So race is a biological concept, distinction. Racial group is distinguished along physical lines, theoretically, and an ethnic group is along cultural lines. So, for example, ethnic groups take a sense of identity around their nationhood, their nationality, language differences, and also religious differences as well. For example, Jewish Americans take their identity, ethnic identity around their religion. Uh, okay, so then the chapter also distinguishes, uh, defines minority groups and then distinguishes two types. Minority groups, subgroups within a society that can be distinguished from members of the dominant group by visible identifying characteristics, including physical and cultural attributes. Minority group is a group that the minority status is built around a relationship. So when we talk about a minority status or a minority group, it's a relational concept. It's in relation with another group. Historically, that other group would be the dominant group. So dominant minority group relationships are produced in history, and just because two groups come together and there may be some tension, some ethnocentricity between the two, does not necessarily mean that a dominant minority group relationship will develop. It's under certain circumstances, and just remember that minority groups are not based on numbers, for example. That's a popular notion. If we look at South Africa, for example, the white elites make up a very small part of the population, but they have historically been the dominant group historically, especially under apartheid. And then the black South Africans, though vastly outnumber the white South Africans, have historically been a minority group. So when we talk about minority groups, we're talking about a relational. We're talking about a relationship with another group that becomes the dominant group. It's a struggle over scarce resources in general, and whoever wins out that struggle becomes the dominant group and have the lion's share availability of scarce resources. The minority group is a group that has been subdued and do not have. They struggle for a piece of the pie, if you will, in terms of scarce resources. So it's based on power, not numbers. Minority group status is based on a social inequality in terms of power, in terms of access to scarce resources, not in terms of less in numbers. Then the chapter also talks about assimilation. And assimilation is a process by which ethnic or racial distinctions between groups disappear because one group is absorbed into another group's culture or because two cultures blend to form a new cultural system. So assimilation, first of all, was an important policy of the United States government up until about the mid-1970s, late 1970s, when we started moving towards the notion of multiculturalism. But prior to that, government policy was based on groups, even for the white immigrant groups coming to the United States, that they needed to assimilate, that is, lose their cultural differences and blend into the majority society. And for many of the white ethnic groups, like the Irish, for example, one of the most discriminated against and suffered from prejudice was the Irish. In fact, many of the stereotypes that were used against African Americans were turned on the white Irish when they immigrated. But because they were similar racially in terms of physical features, over time they lost those cultural differences and the dialect, and began to assimilate into the dominant middle class white society, and lost that difference, and thus they became very, not totally, but very assimilated. And you can see it in terms of the occupational scale. They begin to be represented as mayors and other hires, all up and down the occupational scale. We find the Irish, and so we talk about secondary and cultural assimilation. We can qualify that in a second, but the book talks about two types of assimilation. One's called absorption, the one I just described, that a group is expected to lose its cultural differences and to be assimilated into the dominant middle class society. The other one is called the melting pot, where two groups come together, and there's this sort of imagery of equality between groups. That groups come together on equal footing, and then they all share a little bit of their cultural blend. They blend their cultures together to build what, in the United States we talk about the American mosaic, cultural mosaic. Both of these theories, simulation theory has been problematic because it's never been it's never happened fully. I mean, it's never happened in the way that some of the early theorists thought it would. For example, in the 1970s, we had a big turnaround where culturally in the United States, those ethnic groups that were supposed to have, immigrant groups that were supposed to have been integrated, assimilated, turned around and began to again accentuate their hyphenated identity. So Irish Americans, Polish Americans, French Americans, German Americans. They began to celebrate the difference. Actually, kind of took off after a book by Alex Haley it was called Roots, and it became a very best-selling book in a very popular TV series. And after that, it was just really a big swell up of interest in people's cultural roots, and it really took hold. This flies in the face of simulation theory. It should be that, for simulation theory, it should be that people are they forget about their past and they become assimilated. There's no cultural differences left, but we've seen that turn around. There's never been full assimilation. Seen the same thing with Native Americans that have resisted assimilation, and so that began to change policies quite a bit. So that now we talk more about multiculturalism, allowing people to keep their cultural differences and we live together in harmony. That's the newer approach, and that has to do with the failure of assimilation to a great extent, but also has to do with the growing population of immigrant groups. And as people of color in the country, in terms of population, will be a majority mid-century. By 2050, white Americans will be a numerical minority group in the United States, and so that has also had an impact on moving away from assimilation as a governmental policy. In terms of simulation, one other that we're not really tested on here is for many of the forced minority groups, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, the simulation experience has been forced assimilation. So we call it, another term for it is Anglo-conformity assimilation. That's where groups were forced to assimilate. And so this was not, really doesn't reflect the racialized groups in the United States experiences in terms of the melting pot theory, because they never started on an equal footing anyway. They never had a chance just to equally give a little, blend their culture with the dominant culture. Certainly there has been some of that. I mean, we can talk about an American mosaic, but to talk about it happening on equal footing is quite problematic when you look at those groups that were that experienced forced assimilation. So anyway, read about that. Now, in terms on page 252 on through good bit of this, the rest of these, about 5 or 6 pages there, talking about discrimination, prejudice. I'll try to be brief. I usually teach this as the key concepts in studying dominant minority group relationships, and I use these 4 concepts. On one side of the equation, I look at prejudice, and I look at individual discrimination on one side, and you can draw a line, and on the next side, I have racist ideology and institutional discrimination on the right side. You can kind of draw just a line down the middle and put prejudice and individual discrimination on the left side, ideological racism and institutional discrimination on the right side. And I do that to distinguish them because, and again, I'm not testing you on, because I don't really do that in the book. I'm just trying to help you trying to get to know these a little better, is that individual discrimination happens on an individual basis, on an everyday basis. We individuals can discriminate against others through our actions or through our non-actions. Prejudice is also at that individual level. It takes place between interacting individuals. Well, in the case of prejudice, a prejudiced individual happens within. So the way to distinguish prejudice and discrimination is that prejudice is a state of feeling and thinking. So it's an inward state, if you will. It's not an outward action. When we take action based on our prejudices or discrimination, that's called a prejudice, thinking and feeling. When we take action, that's called discrimination. We're taking action on our ways of perceiving, thinking, and feeling about other groups of people. So with prejudice, then, the prejudiced individual tends to use stereotypical thinking, highly negative generalizations about others in order to make sense of their interaction with people from that group. And when they interact with people from that group, they tend to interact with them in terms of their stereotypes. They place them within these large negative group stereotype characteristics. And we can call that, so there's two dimensions of it. One we can call cognitive. So the cognitively prejudiced individual uses stereotypes when they think about other groups of people, and these negative generalizations. But they can also be, a person can also be affectively prejudiced. That's on the feeling level, emotional level. So an affectively prejudiced individual may have just some obscure negative feelings of maybe disgust or hatred or even fear when they're around members of a particular group that they're prejudicial against. They may be cognitively prejudiced and not harbor a lot of affective prejudice. That's possible. A person can be mostly affectively prejudiced but not harbor any real stereotypes about the group. They just can't place a finger on it. They just have negative feelings about a certain group of people. And when they're in their company, they may feel anger or disgust again, or fear. But generally, 9 times out of 10, these two go together. When we talk about individual discrimination, this is when we take action. And for example, if you're a business owner and you won't hire females for any positions at your store, for example, that would be an act of individual discrimination. So individual discrimination and prejudice happens at the everyday level of our interaction on a daily basis. On the other side of the equation, you have ideological racism or racist ideology and institutional discrimination. This does not take place at the everyday level. This is more reserved for a societal level, at the macro level within the structure of society. It's not on the everyday basis. So let's start with institutionalized discrimination. Is discrimination that is designed, policies within institutions that get played out on an everyday basis that discriminate against people. You can have two types of institutional discrimination, a blatant form and an unintended form. A blatant form of institutional discrimination is where the policies within the institution is laid out on the cuff. That is, it's for everybody to see. So, for example, an intended form would be like slavery in the United States. Also, segregate the Jim Crow law segregation also is a intended form of institutionalized discrimination. The policies are put into place. Schools are segregated. Public places are segregated along racial lines, and everybody knows about it. It's all out on the cuff. That's an intended form. Unintended institutional discrimination are policies put in place that indirectly hurt others. And for the most part, this is the type of institutional discrimination we have today. Policies put in place, like cutting food stamps, for example, which is, I don't think, it's hard to say it's unintended. It could be an intended form if it comes about. It could be to, well, it could be unintended in some interpretations that it's being done in order to save the budget, to help with budget costs in the country, and indirectly it affects poor people because they don't have the income to get adequate food, and so cutting programs is going to hurt them. Uh, we could say it theoretically, indirectly, but for a lot of us, we'd say it's really a direct program, a direct policy. If you think that people are doing it in order to hurt others or to hurt the poor, or having a war against the poor people or something, then yeah, you could say it was a direct. It's really kind of hard to say because we're not always in the boardrooms where a lot of decisions are made. Some other really good examples of unintended would be like, let's say the president tomorrow decides he's going to cut lunch programs across the board in schools to save on the economy, save on the budget. Who's going to get hurt worse? Is it going to be middle class, upper middle class school children that are going to get hurt, or will it be those who live in poor neighborhoods who don't have, maybe they are existing on food stamps or low income? Which group is going to get hurt more so? And from that standpoint, we could even take it further. Which groups are overrepresented in poor communities? That would be mostly your minority people of color. And so there would be, so this would be unintended institutional discrimination that hurts a group of people. Another would be tomorrow we decide that all police officers will have to have a college education in terms of getting a job with the police force. That could indirectly hurt minority groups who have not had enough time to catch up with the dominant group in terms of gaining degrees. So that it would hurt their chances of getting certain positions because of the lack of education or being behind in credentials in the society. So that would be a form of indirect institutional discrimination. So we have these two forms, blatant form and unintended form. Racist ideology is important to look at, or I call it ideological racism. Is a systematic set of ideas using the notion of race and putting the tag of superior inferiority. But generally, where we find blatant forms of ideological racism, there also will be a corresponding systematic set of racist ideologies that help to legitimate that. So ideologies work to help legitimate certain social arrangements. That's the purpose of ideologies. If you say that that people need to be individuals to work hard to get ahead, and then through their own efforts they can become wealthy and successful. That might be true to some extent, but it also works as a class ideology for the elites, because guess what? They're already on top of the heap, and to help stabilize, to help legitimate their like you saw on the chart, the 1% in the income, the wealth inequality. In order to legitimate that, you can use such ideas that these people have worked hard, and you can work hard, and everybody can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps to get ahead. This can become a class ideology. It's utilized to legitimate the social inequality and to legitimate the position of those to the dominant group, if you will. Same thing here with race and ethnicity. With blatant forms of institutional discrimination, you can utilize a racist ideologies or ideological racism to cement and to give credence, give legitimacy to the ruling group in that situation. So, we tend to reserve these to certain cases. So, for example, apartheid South Africa was based in blatant form of institutional discrimination, and ideological racism was utilized to give a good reasoning, a good excuse, a good to legitimate in the eyes of others that this was a legitimate situation. We saw it with Nazi Germany, blatant institutional discrimination, especially towards the Jewish people in Europe, and to justify the genocide. Uh, Nazi ideology was put in place and was based in a racist ideology to give justification, to legitimize the Holocaust, if you will. And then in the United States, we saw the same thing with slavery, and especially after slavery with the segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, up until the 1960s with the success of the Civil Rights Movement. Same kind of scenario in that you have a blatant form, the society is based in a blatant form of institutionalized discrimination, through laws, through policies, all the way down to the everyday culture, if you will, is informed in this ideological racism, and it works to legitimate that system. So, for example, one of the big successes of the Civil Rights Movement was the breaking the back of ideological racism in the South. And one way to think about these concepts also is that, maybe we can reduce or we can remove policies and laws that discriminate, and we still have prejudice and discrimination at the individual level. And also, so it's not a one-way treatment. I mean, we can work at getting rid of certain. We can work at getting rid of prejudice, but it's so tied in with the flow of history and the structure of institutional discrimination. For example, we see this today also with trying to pass laws that discriminate against voters, for example, and other policies that are in struggles over policy and laws that may discriminate. All this continues, and so it's a very complex situation. So all of these concepts are interrelated, even though they tend to have an autonomous effect on society as well. But one of the successes of the Civil Rights Movement was that it did break the back of ideological racism and institutional discrimination. And the leaders in the movement, Dr. King and others, knew that they were aware that they couldn't just change people's perceptions at the individual level, that they really, if they wanted success, they had to go after that at the macro level. And if you can dismantle institutional discrimination, blatant forms, then that's going to help to reduce prejudice in society over the long run. I think that's where the movement was very successful in doing so. So these four concepts are very important. If you take a class with me in social inequalities, we spend the whole semester on these four concepts and look at various groups and situations in society and globally through the semester. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this for this particular chapter. Go ahead and close out while we have a chance. Then I'm going to come right behind with another little lecture concept review for our next chapter. Alrighty, on gender. So let's stop now, and then I'll take up the gender chapter in the next segment. All right.